Deep in the heart of a forgotten town nestled between misty hills stood the Hollow Grove Library. Built in the 1800s, its towering Gothic spires and cracked stone walls gave it an ominous presence. The locals avoided it at all costs, passing down chilling tales of the strange occurrences that plagued its halls. Despite its expansive collection of rare texts, the library was rarely visited, save for a few scholars and the occasional brave soul lured by its mysterious reputation. Sarah Weaver, a graduate student in folklore, arrived in Hollow Grove on a cold autumn evening. She was researching urban legends and had heard rumors of the library's haunted past. A journal written by one of the library's original architects, Elias Venn, was said to contain the truth behind the horrors that surrounded the place. Driven by curiosity and ambition, Sarah decided to uncover the mystery for her thesis. The librarian, an elderly man named Mr. Clive, greeted Sarah with a hollow gaze. His thin frame and trembling hands betrayed years of weariness. When she mentioned the journal, his face darkened, and he warned her against pursuing it. "Some things are better left buried," he whispered, but Sarah, undeterred, pressed on. The library was vast, its shelves stretching endlessly into dim shadows. Dust motes floated in the cold air, and the faint smell of decay lingered. The farther she ventured, the more unsettling it became. The sound of pages turning seemed to come from unseen corners, though she was alone. Whispers brushed against her ears, too faint to comprehend but impossible to ignore. After hours of searching, Sarah found the journal locked away in a glass cabinet in the restricted section. Its cracked leather cover was marked with strange symbols that seemed to writhe under the flickering light. As she opened it, a chill swept through the air, and the lights above dimmed. The journal detailed Venn's descent into madness as he worked on the library. He wrote of strange voices guiding his hand, compelling him to design a labyrinth of shelves and hidden rooms. He described nights when shadows moved independently, stalking him as he worked. Venn's final entry was particularly disturbing. He claimed the library was not a place for knowledge, but a doorway to something ancient and malevolent. It was a structure built to contain it, but over the years the seals had weakened. The more Sarah read, the more she felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes upon her. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the sensation grew unbearable. That night, she decided to stay in the library to dig deeper. Clive pleaded with her to leave, but she brushed him off, determined to finish her research. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature plummeted. The lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder, now forming fragmented sentences. "You shouldn't have come. It sees you. It knows your name." Sarah's flashlight illuminated the walls, revealing faint carvings she hadn't noticed before. Grotesque faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and accusing. The shelves seemed to close in around her, rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking. She turned a corner and found herself in a room she didn't recognize, despite having mapped the library earlier. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it rested an open book. Its pages glowed faintly, and black ink oozed from its text, spilling onto the floor. Compelled by an unseen force, Sarah approached. The book's words shifted and danced, forming sentences directed at her. "Release us," it demanded. The room quaked, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. Shadows spilled from the corners, coalescing into a towering figure with hollow eyes and spindly limbs. It spoke in a voice that reverberated through her skull. "You are the key," it hissed. Panic surged through Sarah as she tried to flee, but the shelves closed off her path. The figure reached out, its shadowy hand grazing her shoulder, and a searing pain shot through her. Her vision blurred as her mind filled with incomprehensible images. Endless darkness, writhing entities, and a deep, echoing void. When Sarah awoke, she was outside the library, clutching the journal. Mr. Clive found her trembling and incoherent. He took the journal from her and burned it in the fireplace of his office, muttering prayers under his breath. But Sarah was never the same. She spoke of voices that haunted her dreams and shadows that lingered at the edge of her vision. The library, however, remained. Its spires loomed over the town, untouched by time or fire. And late at night, passers-by swore they could hear faint whispers emanating from its walls, as if it were alive, waiting for its next visitor.
Story number 2.
The story of the Red Room is whispered among library workers across the country. Every library has its own version, but no one is quite sure where it started. What's unsettling is that the details are always eerily similar, and those who've encountered the room often disappear or are forever changed. It's said the room appears in libraries only late at night when the lights are dim, and the air feels unnaturally still. No matter how familiar someone is with the library's layout, this room seems to materialize out of nowhere, hidden behind a forgotten stack or down an unmarked hallway. The first sign is subtle, a strange, coppery scent, faint at first but unmistakable the closer you get. The smell of blood. Caroline was a young librarian who prided herself on her methodical nature. She worked at the Ashfield Public Library, a building that had stood for over a century and was rumored to be haunted. Though Caroline didn't believe in such nonsense, she had heard the rumors from her co-workers about the Red Room. It's just a local ghost story, she told herself. One stormy evening, Caroline was alone, cataloging books late into the night. The library was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rumble of thunder. As she worked, she noticed something peculiar. A row of books she had just organized was out of order. Frowning, she moved to fix it, only to find that the books had been placed upside down, their spines facing inward. She brushed it off, assuming her fatigue was playing tricks on her. But as the night stretched on, strange things began happening. A flickering light in the history section caught her attention. When she went to investigate, she found a single book lying on the floor, an ancient, leather-bound tome with no title. Curious, she opened it. The pages were blank, except for the faint, handwritten words on the last page. "Don't enter the Red Room." Chills crept down her spine, but Caroline laughed nervously and set the book back on the shelf. "Someone's idea of a joke," she muttered. Yet, as she turned to leave, she noticed something unsettling. The hallway that should have led back to the main desk now stretched endlessly before her, lined with unfamiliar shelves. Her breath quickened as she realized she was in a part of the library she'd never seen before. The coppery smell grew stronger, making her stomach churn. She turned around, but the path behind her had disappeared. The only way forward was a door at the end of the hall. Its frame was painted a deep, unsettling red, and carved into the wood were scratches, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to claw their way out. Against her better judgment, Caroline approached the door. The air was thick and suffocating, and the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo far too loudly. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. It was ice cold, and as she turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in dim, crimson light. The room was empty except for a single chair placed in the center. On the chair sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. Caroline stepped inside, drawn by an inexplicable force. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her and the tape recorder clicked to life. A distorted voice began to play. It was barely human, a guttural mix of whispers and growls. "You shouldn't have come," it said. Caroline froze, her heart pounding. The voice continued, describing events from her life that no one could possibly know. Her childhood fears, her secrets, her dreams. Then, it began to speak of her future in chilling detail. "You will not leave," the voice declared, and suddenly the walls of the room seemed to move. Blood seeped from the cracks, pooling on the floor and rising steadily. Caroline screamed and pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room felt alive, pulsating like a beating heart. Shadows moved in the corners, growing larger, forming shapes, horrible, twisting figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Desperate, she turned back to the chair, where the tape recorder now played a cacophony of screams. She tore it off the chair and hurled it to the ground, but the voices only grew louder. The blood rose to her knees, then her waist. The walls were closing in, the shadows reaching for her. And then everything went black. When the morning staff arrived, they found the library in perfect order, except for Caroline. She was never seen again. Her desk was untouched, her belongings left behind, but there was no sign of her. However, in the history section, a new book had appeared on the shelf. It was the same leather-bound tome she had found the night before. This time, the last page was not blank. In her handwriting, it read, "I told you not to enter."
Story number 3.
In the heart of a rural town stood the long-abandoned Whispering Pines Library, a sprawling brick building with boarded-up windows and an air of forgotten tragedy. Decades ago, it had been a thriving community hub until a series of mysterious disappearances led to its closure. It was said that those who entered the library never left the same, or at all. Locals spoke of whispers that seemed to follow anyone brave enough to step inside, but no one truly believed the tales until Emily Harper arrived. Emily, a journalist known for debunking urban legends, came to town determined to uncover the truth behind the library's dark reputation. With her camera, notebook, and a flashlight, she approached the library one cold November night, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves and decay. The front doors were chained shut, but a broken basement window offered a way in. As she crawled through the gap, the air inside was oppressive, thick with dust and something else, something foul and metallic. Her flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing rows of overturned chairs, collapsed bookshelves, and scattered papers that crumbled underfoot. She started her investigation methodically, snapping photos and taking notes. The library, despite its disrepair, was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No sound of wind, no creaking of old wood, not even the scurry of vermin. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. Emily wandered deeper, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. Then she heard it, a faint murmur like distant voices. She froze, holding her breath. The sound grew louder, not coming from a single direction, but seemingly surrounding her. It was a chorus of whispers, disjointed and frantic, words overlapping until they were impossible to discern. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. She pressed on, her flashlight catching glimpses of unsettling details. Deep gouges in the wooden floors, books with pages torn out and burned edges, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls in a substance that looked alarmingly like dried blood. In the far corner of the library, she found a door. It wasn't on the blueprints she'd studied beforehand. Its wood was darker than the rest, almost black, with deep claw marks raked across its surface. Against her better judgment, Emily opened it. The room beyond was freezing, and her breath puffed out in small clouds. At the center of the room was a single desk, illuminated by a pale flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. On the desk sat a book, its cover pulsing faintly as though it were alive. Emily approached cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But the journalist in her pushed forward. The book's title was engraved in a language she didn't recognize, the letters jagged and sharp. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers returned, louder now, almost screaming. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the room changed. The walls twisted and stretched, the door slamming shut behind her. The desk dissolved into ash, leaving the book floating in midair. Its pages flipped violently, revealing horrifying images, faces contorted in agony, skeletal hands reaching from the void, and a swirling black abyss. The whispers became coherent, a single voice rising above the cacophony. "You should not have come." The floor beneath her cracked, revealing a bottomless pit. Shadows poured from the walls, coiling around her limbs like living chains. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The book opened to its final page, where her name was scrawled in blood. "We've been waiting for you, Emily." Shh. The shadows pulled her into the darkness, and the last thing she saw was the book snapping shut with a deafening clap. Days later, the townsfolk found her car parked outside the library, its engine cold. The broken window in the basement was boarded up as though it had never been there. Emily was never seen again. Weeks later, a new rumor began to circulate. The Whispering Pines Library had a new book in its collection, placed on a pristine shelf deep in the building's heart. Its cover bore her name, and if you dared to open it, you would hear her screams, trapped forever in the pages of the cursed library.
Story number 4.
The Silent Archivist is a story that no librarian dares to tell above a whisper, especially those working late shifts in older libraries. It's a tale of a spectral figure said to haunt archives, hunting anyone who dares to disturb the forgotten volumes. It began in Harper's Hill Library, an imposing structure built in the late 19th century. Its basement archive was a labyrinth of ancient manuscripts, maps, and records, many so brittle they had not been touched in decades. The archivist, Harold Price, had been a dedicated man who worked alone in the basement, caring for the library's rarest treasures. But one evening, he vanished without a trace. The night Harold disappeared, the security cameras in the library recorded something strange. At 3:03 a.m., the lights in the basement flickered violently, and a high-pitched screech, like the sound of tearing metal, was picked up on the microphones. The last frame of footage showed Harold standing by a shelf, his face frozen in terror before the camera feed cut out. When staff searched the next day, they found no sign of him, only his thick-rimmed glasses on the floor, lenses shattered. The library carried on after his disappearance, but whispers of strange occurrences began to spread. Workers claimed to hear the faint sound of shuffling footsteps and the soft rustling of pages, even when the basement was empty. Books and papers would rearrange themselves overnight, and the air in the archive grew colder with each passing year. One fateful winter evening, a young intern named Clara was tasked with organizing the archive. It was her first night alone in the basement, and the silence pressed down on her like a heavy weight. The air was damp, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At first, it was small things, a shadow flickering just out of sight, the sound of a book falling in the distance. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was her imagination. But as the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder, a steady tapping as if someone was drumming their fingers on the metal shelves. "Hello," Clara called, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. She turned back to her work, her heart pounding. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the far end of the aisle, shrouded in darkness. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and its hands, long and skeletal, clutched a thick, leather-bound book. "Who's there?" Clara demanded, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and disappeared behind the shelf. Gathering her courage, she followed, her flashlight shaking in her hand. But when she rounded the corner, no one was there. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the archive. Shelves began to tremble, and books toppled to the ground. Clara backed away, but the figure reappeared in front of her, blocking her path. This time she saw it clearly. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes empty sockets that oozed black ichor. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the faint rustling of pages. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, extending its bony hand toward her. Clara screamed and bolted, running through the maze of shelves. The archive seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit eluding her no matter which direction she turned. The figure's footsteps followed, slow but deliberate, its presence suffocating. Finally, Clara stumbled into the main room of the archive and slammed the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, gasping for breath, but the cold didn't leave. The lights flickered violently, and she realized with horror that she was not alone. The figure stood in the center of the room, its book still clutched in its hands. It opened the book, and the pages turned on their own, faster and faster, until the text dissolved into swirling black ink. The ink began to pour out of the book, pooling on the floor and crawling toward her like living tendrils. Clara tried to scream, but the ink reached her feet, climbing her legs and pulling her down. The last thing she saw was the figure's hollow face leaning over her and its raspy voice whispering, "Knowledge must be preserved." When the staff arrived the next morning, Clara was gone. The only sign of her was her name, now etched into the spine of a book that hadn't been there before. Its title was simple, The Archivist's Apprentice. To this day, librarians claim to see the silent archivist roaming the aisles late at night, always carrying that cursed book. If you hear the sound of shuffling footsteps behind you in a library and feel the air grow unnaturally cold, don't turn around. If you do, you might find yourself becoming the next story in his collection.
Story number 5.
The Room with No Exit is a story whispered among library janitors and night staff, a tale they share only when the lights are bright and the doors are locked tight. It centers on a strange phenomenon that has reportedly occurred in libraries all over the world. A door that appears where it shouldn't, leading to a place no one has ever returned from. It was a cold, quiet evening at the Harlow County Library, and Lily, a part-time custodian, was finishing her shift. She liked working nights. The silence was calming, and the endless rows of books felt like an escape from her chaotic life. The library was old, with its towering shelves, creaky wooden floors, and dim, yellowed lights, giving it a timeless atmosphere. That night, as Lily mopped the floor in the West Wing, she noticed something odd. At the far end of the aisle, a door she didn't recognize stood ajar. It was plain, unmarked, and made of dark wood that didn't match the library's interior. She frowned. She'd worked there for 3 years and had memorized every corner of the building. This door had never been there before. "Probably a storage closet I missed," she muttered to herself, though unease prickled at her skin. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached. The closer she got, the colder the air became. By the time she reached the door, her breath was visible, puffing out in small, misty clouds. The scent of mildew and something faintly metallic wafted out from the darkened room. Lily hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, but she told herself it was just an old building, prone to drafts and strange smells. Holding her flashlight, she pushed the door open wider. The room beyond was impossibly large, far too big to fit inside the library's floor plan. Shelves stretched endlessly into the shadows, stacked not with books but with objects. Old dolls with cracked faces, dusty clocks frozen at midnight, rusted tools, and photographs of people whose faces had been scratched out. The floor was tiled with smooth black stone that reflected the faint glow of her flashlight. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the room were alive and listening. As she stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind her. She spun around, heart racing, and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she yanked harder, but the door remained sealed. "Okay, stay calm," she whispered, turning back to the room. She reasoned there had to be another way out. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant ticking of clocks that didn't match the broken ones on the shelves. Her footsteps echoed eerily as she ventured deeper into the room, the flashlight beam bouncing off the strange objects. She noticed something peculiar. The further she walked, the more personal the items became. A scarf she recognized from her childhood, a stuffed bear she'd lost when she was 6, a photograph of her family, her mother and father smiling at the camera with a space between them where her brother should have been. Her legs trembled and she stumbled backward, her flashlight dropping to the floor with a clatter. The beam swept across the room, illuminating something in the distance. A figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, with long, angular limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. Its face was obscured by shadows, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her. The figure didn't move, but as her flashlight flickered, it seemed to grow closer with each blink of the light. Lily scrambled to her feet and ran. The shelves seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, forming a maze around her. No matter how far she ran, the door never reappeared. The ticking grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound like distant growling. She turned a corner and stopped dead. The figure was in front of her now, standing perfectly still, its hand outstretched. In its palm was an open book. The pages were blank, but as she stared, words began to form, written in a dark, viscous liquid that dripped down the edges of the page. "Write your name." The growling intensified, and the room seemed to close in around her. She tried to run again, but the figure's hand snapped forward with impossible speed, grabbing her wrist and forcing the book into her hands. The cold was unbearable, seeping into her bones.
"Write your name."
The figure repeated, its voice a deep, guttural whisper that echoed in her skull. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she shook her head, clutching the book but refusing to obey. The figure leaned closer, its face now visible in the dim light. It was featureless, a smooth, pale surface devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. Yet she could feel its rage, its hunger. The book began to burn in her hands, the pages turning black and smoldering, but she couldn't drop it. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was the figure's hand reaching toward her face. The next morning, the library staff found Lily's mop and bucket abandoned in the West Wing. The door was gone, and there was no trace of her. Only her name was scrawled in dark ink on the wall where the door had been, the letters dripping as though freshly written. A week later, the door appeared again, this time in a different library across the country. It waits, patient and silent, for someone else to wander too close.
Story number 6.
The Midnight Borrower is a tale whispered by librarians and archivists, particularly those who work late shifts in libraries with old, forgotten collections. It's said that there is a borrower who comes not for knowledge, but for something far more sinister. The Grayson Library, an ancient institution nestled in a foggy corner of New England, was known for its sprawling collection of rare books, many of which hadn't been touched in decades. The library's night shift had always been uneventful, and the sole overnight staff member, Greg, liked it that way. He enjoyed the solitude, the quiet hum of the overhead lights, and the scent of aging paper. It was peaceful, until the night he met the Midnight Borrower. It started innocently enough. Greg was in the basement organizing the returns cart. The library was eerily silent as usual, save for the occasional groan of the old building settling. As he worked, he heard the faint sound of a bell ringing. It was soft, like the kind on a child's bicycle, but it echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Frowning, Greg set down the books and walked back upstairs. The main floor was empty, as it always was after hours, but the sound of the bell persisted, now coming from the far end of the library near the rare book section. His pulse quickened. No one should have been there. The doors were locked, and he hadn't seen anyone come in all night. "Hello," he called, his voice cutting through the silence. No response. Cautiously, he approached the rare book section. The bell grew louder with each step, its chime distorted and metallic. As he turned the corner, his flashlight caught a flicker of movement. A figure stood at the farthest shelf, draped in tattered black robes that dragged along the floor. Its back was to him, but its head was cocked at an unsettling angle, as though it were listening to something only it could hear. "Library's closed," Greg said, his voice wavering. The figure didn't move. Greg stepped closer, and the figure slowly turned. What he saw made his stomach drop. The figure's face, or lack thereof, was a gaping void, a swirling darkness that seemed to draw the light from his flashlight. In one skeletal hand, it held a book bound in cracked blood-red leather. In the other, it clutched a bell that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Before Greg could move, the figure spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, layered with countless others. "I seek what was never returned." The words sent a chill through him, and he stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. The figure pointed a bony finger at him, and suddenly the air around Greg grew heavy, oppressive. Images flooded his mind, blurred visions of people hunched over desks, their faces hollow with terror, clutching books with shaking hands. He realized with dawning horror that they were all holding overdue library books. "I don't have anything," Greg cried, panic rising in his chest. "I don't even borrow books." The figure tilted its head as if considering him. Then it stepped forward, its movements impossibly fluid, almost like smoke. Greg backed away, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The bell rang again, louder this time, and he felt an unbearable pressure in his ears. "You work in the house of knowledge," the figure hissed. "Your debt is inherited." Greg turned to run, but the shelves around him began to shift and close in, forming an endless corridor of books. No matter which way he turned, the figure was always ahead of him, its empty face looming closer. The bell rang faster, its chime echoing in his skull, each ring louder and sharper than the last. Desperate, Greg grabbed a random book from the shelf and hurled it at the figure. It stopped midair, suspended as though caught in an invisible web, before slowly disintegrating into ash. The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound reverberating through the library. "Knowledge cannot be destroyed," it said, its voice echoing. "Only paid for." Greg screamed as the figure lunged, the bell's final chime ringing in his ears. When the library's morning staff arrived, Greg was nowhere to be found. His flashlight lay abandoned in the rare book section, its beam still flickering weakly. On the desk near the checkout counter, a single book sat open. It was blank except for one line scrawled across the first page in dark, dripping ink. "Overdue." From that day on, the Grayson Library gained a new policy. A lockbox for overdue fines, mandatory for all visitors. The midnight borrower hasn't been seen since, but librarians say you can still hear the faint ring of a bell if you're alone in the stacks late at night. If you do, it's already too late.
Story number 7.
The book that reads you is a story passed down among library goers who swear they've seen it. A book that doesn't have a title, an author, or even a shelf number. It appears without warning, vanishes without explanation, and leaves behind those who find it changed, if they leave at all. The tale begins at the Ravenwood Public Library, a small, Gothic building tucked in the shadow of a crumbling cathedral. Olivia, a grad student, frequented the library to work on her thesis about lost literary works. She loved the quiet charm of the place, with its mahogany shelves and the faint scent of parchment lingering in the air. But one stormy evening, as thunder rolled outside, Olivia stumbled across a book she swore hadn't been there before. It was tucked away in the furthest corner of the library, lying on a dusty table. The book had no title, no markings on its spine, and was bound in a strange material that felt neither like leather nor cloth. Intrigued, Olivia picked it up. The cover was cold to the touch, almost unnervingly so, and when she opened it, the pages were blank. Her brow furrowed. "What's the point of this?" she muttered. As she flipped through, the pages began to fill, not with printed words, but with lines scrawled in her own handwriting. Olivia froze. The text described her life in eerie, exact detail. Her childhood in a small town, her move to the city, her struggles with her thesis. It even mentioned the library and how she'd found the book. The words appeared as she thought of them, as though the book were drawing them directly from her mind. At first, she was fascinated. The book seemed to know things about her she had long forgotten, bringing buried memories to life. But as she read further, the tone changed. The text began to reveal her secrets, the dark thoughts she'd never dared to say aloud, the guilt she carried, the mistakes she wished she could erase. The words seemed to mock her, twisting her memories into something cruel and distorted. "Okay, this is ridiculous," she said aloud, slamming the book shut. But when she tried to put it down, it clung to her hand, the cover growing colder and colder. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her palm and yelped, letting it fall to the floor. A dark, smoky tendril seeped from the book, curling in the air like a living thing. The library's lights flickered and the temperature plummeted. Olivia backed away as the tendril stretched toward her, whispering in a voice that was faint but unmistakably hers. "You can't hide from the truth." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The tendril darted forward, wrapping around her wrist. Images flashed before her eyes, terrifying visions of herself wandering through endless, dark corridors, clutching the book as it whispered endlessly into her ear. The whispers grew louder, becoming screams that echoed in her mind. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The tendril tightened its grip, and the book flew open again, the blank pages now filled with frantic, scrawled text. "Do you want to know how it ends?" Olivia clawed at the tendril, her heart pounding as she fought against the pull. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the nearest chair and smashed it against the book. The tendril recoiled, and the book slammed shut, emitting a high-pitched wail that shook the shelves around her. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only a faint scorch mark on the floor. The next day, Olivia returned to the library, desperate to convince herself it had all been a nightmare. But when she asked the librarian about the book, the woman's face went pale. "You're lucky," she said quietly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Most people who find it don't come back." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. The librarian leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "The book doesn't just read you, it takes you. It knows your fears, your regrets, your darkest secrets, and if you let it, it writes your ending." Olivia left Ravenwood Public Library that day and never returned. But even now, in the quiet moments when she's alone, she sometimes hears the faint rustle of pages turning, and she can't shake the feeling that the book is still out there, waiting for her, or someone else, to open it again.
Story number 8.
The Whispering Shelves is a story that lingers among librarians and late-night researchers, a tale about a section of the library where silence is more than a rule. It's a warning. They say if you stay too long among those shelves, you might never leave. It began at the Somerset Academic Library, a sprawling maze of corridors, alcoves, and towering bookshelves. The oldest part of the library, simply called the North Wing, was rarely used. Its books were ancient, with spines that cracked like brittle bones and pages yellowed by time. The air there was always cold, as though the wing had been forgotten by the warmth of the sun. One evening, Jacob, a graduate student working on his doctoral thesis, decided to explore the North Wing. He was desperate to find an obscure text he'd seen cited but never located. The main librarian had warned him, "That wing's catalog isn't reliable. Books go missing all the time." But Jacob shrugged it off. He liked the idea of being alone in the quiet, untouched part of the library. As he entered the North Wing, the heavy wooden door creaked shut behind him, the sound echoing ominously. The air was damp, carrying a faint smell of mildew. He scanned the rows of bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines as he searched. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards under his weight. After nearly an hour of searching, Jacob found the book he was looking for, a thick, leather-bound volume titled The Unwritten Histories. The cover was blank except for its title, embossed in gold. He pulled it from the shelf, surprised by its weight, and carried it to one of the small study tables tucked between the shelves. As he opened the book, a strange sensation washed over him. The pages were filled with intricate handwriting, but as he began to read, the words shifted on the page as if they were alive. He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. But then he realized the text wasn't written in English or in any language he could recognize. It looked like jagged symbols and spirals that seemed to move under his gaze. Suddenly, he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible. He froze, his eyes darting around the room. The whisper came again, closer this time, but he couldn't make out the words. His heart pounded as he stood and scanned the shelves, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. He backed away from the table, his flashlight flickering. The air around him grew colder, and the shadows between the shelves seemed to deepen, stretching toward him like grasping hands. Jacob turned to leave, but the rows of shelves no longer looked the same. They stretched endlessly in all directions, forming a labyrinth that hadn't been there before. Panic set in as he tried to retrace his steps, but no matter where he turned, the shelves seemed to close in, blocking his path. The whispers grew deafening now, a cacophony of voices speaking in that strange, jagged language. Then he saw them. Shadows moving between the shelves, humanoid shapes with impossibly long limbs and hollow faces. They didn't walk, but glided, their heads tilting as though listening for him. Desperate, Jacob clutched the book to his chest and ran. The figures followed, their movements jerky and unnatural, their whispering growing louder, echoing in his ears. He stumbled over a loose floorboard and fell, the book flying from his hands. As it hit the ground, the whispers stopped. Breathing heavily, Jacob looked up. The figures had vanished, and the oppressive silence returned. He crawled toward the book, hesitant to touch it, but when he opened it again, the text had changed. Instead of the strange symbols, the pages now displayed his own name, over and over in red ink. A chill ran down his spine as the final page filled with new words. "You shouldn't have come here. Now you belong to us." The next morning, the librarians found the North Wing undisturbed, but Jacob was nowhere to be found. The only sign of him was a single book left open on a study table. It was blank, except for one line written on the first page. "Another soul for the shelves." Visitors to the North Wing now report hearing whispers when they stay too long, and some swear they've seen shadowy figures moving just out of sight. The librarians warn against lingering in that part of the library, but the truly brave or foolish still wander in, curious to see if the shelves will whisper their name.
Story number 9.
The Librarian's Shadow is a tale whispered among the staff of old libraries, especially those that seem to have more shelves than any map can account for. It's the story of a ghost, or perhaps something worse, that appears not in reflections but in shadows. At the Hollowbrook Library, a centuries-old institution known for its dim, cavernous halls and collection of rare, forgotten texts, new hires were always warned about the shadow. Most dismissed it as a silly superstition, a way for the seasoned staff to haze newcomers. But Evelyn, a newly hired evening attendant, soon learned it was more than just a story. Evelyn worked late shifts, reshelving books and cataloging returns. She enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the soothing sound of pages turning. But one night, as she was finishing up in the restricted archives, she noticed something strange. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the rows of shelves, but one shadow didn't seem to match anything. It wasn't hers. It was too tall, too thin, and its edges were oddly jagged as though it were flickering. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to a trick of the dim lighting. But as she moved down the aisle, the shadow moved with her, not on the floor, but along the shelves, gliding smoothly. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow stopped too. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The room swallowed the sound, leaving only silence. Evelyn took a shaky step back, her eyes fixed on the shadow. It moved again, darting across the spines of the books. Faster now. She turned to run, but the door to the archives creaked shut with a heavy thud. Panic gripped her as she tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, she heard the faint rustle of pages, as though a dozen unseen hands were flipping through books at once. When she turned back, the shadow was gone. Evelyn tried to steady her breathing, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But then she noticed the books around her were no longer aligned neatly on the shelves. Some were jutting out, their spines tilted as though someone had been pulling them. One book in particular caught her eye. It was a massive, leather-bound tome, its cover embossed with strange symbols she didn't recognize. Compelled by some unseen force, Evelyn reached for the book. As her fingers touched the spine, she felt an icy chill race up her arm. The room grew darker, the air heavier, and a faint whisper echoed around her, growing louder with each passing second. "Return what is taken," the voice hissed, deep and hollow. Evelyn dropped the book, stumbling back into the shelves. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. Her eyes darted around the room, but no one was there. Just shadows. And then she saw it. The shadow wasn't cast by anything in the room. It stood upright, a black, humanoid figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its head tilted toward her as if observing her, and though it had no eyes, she could feel its gaze pierce through her. She backed away, clutching a book to her chest as if it might somehow protect her. The shadow moved closer, its jagged edges flickering unnaturally. As it reached for her, its elongated hand stretching out like smoke, Evelyn screamed. The next morning, the library's custodian found the restricted archives door ajar. Inside, the shelves were in perfect order, save for one book lying open on the floor. Evelyn was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were still at the front desk, her coat hanging neatly on the chair, but it was as though she'd vanished. The staff tried to move on, but strange things began happening in the library. Shadows flickered where there shouldn't have been any. Books moved from their places without explanation. And at night, if you stood in the archives and stayed perfectly silent, you could hear soft footsteps and the faint whisper, "Return what is taken." Some say Evelyn broke a rule she didn't know existed, perhaps by touching a forbidden book or disturbing the peace of something ancient. Others claim the library itself is alive, feeding on those who stay too long. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. At Hollowbrook Library, shadows aren't always just shadows.
Story number 10.
In the heart of a small New England town stood an ancient library, its stone facade weathered by centuries of storms and secrets. The Moorgrave Public Library was older than the town itself, its history shrouded in whispers of hauntings and disappearances. Locals avoided it after dark, muttering about the echoes of Moorgrave, the inexplicable sounds and sights that plagued the building. Sophia, a curious journalist, had always been fascinated by the macabre. When she learned about the library's eerie reputation, she decided to investigate. It was said that the library's basement held a collection of books bound in human skin, and its rarest tome, the Libris Obscura, had driven readers mad. The librarian, Mr. Harold Grimsby, a gaunt man with a permanent scowl, was rumored to know the building's deepest secrets. Sophia arrived at the library one rainy evening, her recorder in hand. Grimsby reluctantly granted her access, though he warned her against venturing into the basement. "That's where the unbound books are kept," he said cryptically. Sophia dismissed his warning as superstition and began her exploration. The library felt alive, the air thick with an unsettling energy. Shadows danced in corners where no light reached, and whispers drifted through the aisles, too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. Sophia brushed it off as her imagination, though her unease grew with each step. When she reached the basement, the air changed. It was colder, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. The staircase creaked under her weight, each step an echo that seemed louder than the last. The basement was cluttered with cobwebbed bookshelves and crates, and in the center of the room was a locked glass case. Inside was the Libris Obscura, its cover a disturbing patchwork of flesh and inked runes. Sophia couldn't resist. Using a bobby pin, she picked the lock and opened the case. The book felt warm, almost pulsing, as she lifted it. Its pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols that seemed to writhe when she stared too long. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. In the suffocating darkness, Sophia heard a faint scratching sound. It grew louder, accompanied by guttural whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Her flashlight revealed claw marks appearing on the walls, deep and fresh, as if invisible hands were etching them. She dropped the flashlight and it spun, casting erratic beams of light that caught fleeting glimpses of something moving in the shadows. The whispers became a cacophony, and the book in her hands grew heavier, its warmth turning into a searing heat. Sophia tried to drop it, but her hands wouldn't obey. The runes on the pages began to glow, casting an unnatural light that revealed figures in the room, ethereal and gaunt, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Reader," one of them rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. "You've unbound us." The figures surged forward, their translucent hands reaching for her. Sophia screamed as the world around her dissolved into a void of chaos and shadows. The next morning, Grimsby found the basement in disarray. The glass case was shattered, and the Libris Obscura lay open on the floor, its pages blank and smoking. Of Sophia, there was no trace, save for her recorder. When Grimsby played it back, there were only whispers, sibilant and incomprehensible, until a single chilling phrase emerged: "One more reader for the collection." The library continued to stand, its history growing darker with each passing year. Occasionally, visitors claimed to hear a young woman's scream echoing from the basement, followed by laughter that was decidedly not human. And the whispers? They never stopped.